In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you a very simple, what I call yin-yang technique of mixing textures on your project. In this case, I'm just going to mix a matte texture with a shiny texture for what I call yin-yang. And I am using, for this matte technique that I begin with, I'm using white gesso. This Bob Ross brand is pretty much my favorite, so that's what I'm going to start with. And this is white gesso, not clear gesso. And I'm taking 2 panels of first edition designer series paper by Stampin' Up, which is my all-time favorite background paper. I absolutely love using text. But I want to mute the appearance of the text, and that's what I'm doing with the gesso. So I'm taking a foam brush and just putting a thin layer on top. And the object here is just to get the opacity that you want. So this is completely custom. And you can put 1 layer, you can put a few layers. Just get it to the point where you like how much text is showing through. Now gesso serves a couple purposes. For me, it's going to give me this soft, velvety, matte texture that I'm going to look to combine with a shiny texture. But it also gives a somewhat slick surface a little bit of tooth. So if you need something to stick to the surface, in my case, embossing powder, then it just gives you a little bit rougher base that grabs things like embossing powder a little bit more easily. It's a very versatile product, and I love using it for a bunch of different techniques. Now I'm painting 2 of these panels because I'm going to use the other one in a second project for this same technique. But for this project in this video, I'm just going to use the first one. I'm going to come back and touch this up just a bit, cover up some more of the text at the bottom. And then to prepare it for the next stage, I'm impatient, so I'm going to use my heat gun. You don't have to. You can let it dry naturally if you're a more patient person than I am. But I'm just going to hit it very quickly with my heat gun until the shiny is all gone and it's dry. This doesn't take very long at all. Now in my case, it's important that it be totally dry. So once I have it the way I want it, I can just feel the top of it and make sure that it's all dry. You also might want to shoot the back just a little bit. This will take some of the curl out of the paper. Now I'm going to get myself a new piece of grid paper just so I can work on a clean surface for the next phase. And now we're ready to add the shiny element to my nice soft matte paper. To do that, I'm going to be using some craft ink. This is basic black ink from Stampin' Up. And I'm using the Swallowtail butterfly stamp. Now this is a large stamp, so I will not be using all of the image. So I don't really need to ink up the whole image. I'm just going to ink up a little more than half of it because that's all that's going to fit on my card. So just coat this with craft ink and stamp it wherever you'd like it onto your prepared panel. Now because the gesso is a little bit rough, you'll notice that it's not like stamping on smooth paper. You might have a couple little voids, which is totally okay. You're going to see that that doesn't matter at all in the final product. So now it's ready to add embossing powder. I'm using black detail embossing powder from Stampin' Up. And I'm just going to coat my butterfly. And you'll see how bold the addition of embossing makes this image after we heat it up. Now you'll see that I actually have a little mark where I got some extra ink and some extra embossing powder on my image. And I just use a small paintbrush to get the extra grains of embossing powder off. But in this case, since I'm not using Versamark, I'm actually using black ink. Even if I get the embossing powder off, I still have a little bit of ink on my background, but I'm going to show you how easy that is to fix. First, we're going to heat up the embossing powder and melt it, and this is the shiny element of my project. I suppose I should pick which is yin and which is yang, the shiny or the matte, but I think I would just forget and get confused. Now the butterfly really comes to life after the embossing powder starts to melt, and you can really see that beautiful shine is magnified against the velvet texture of the gessoed Designer Series paper. So just make sure every part of it is melted. That's very important for the next step because we're going to be adding color to the butterfly. And we don't want to pull off part of the image if it's not melted. Now to fix my little mistake, which there are no mistakes in stamping, all I have to do is take a little bit of gesso and cover up that little mark. It's very easy and quick. You'd never know it was there. And then you can just heat it up with your heat gun to dry that little patch very quickly. And what you might have thought was ruined is definitely not. So next I'm going to add a little bit of color. And I'm going to do that with water-based inks. These are Stampin' Up! Dye-based ink pads in Poppy Parade and Summer Sun. And I've put some of the re-inker in the lid of each of the ink pads. And I'm just going to use a little bit of water to make them move around the gesso a little more easily. And I'm just going to paint watercolor on top of this image. I'm not going to be too careful around the edges because I'll show you two things. I'll show you how easy it is to repair a watercolor mistake on the gesso. And also I'm going to add a shadow underneath the butterfly. And so a little bit outside the lines isn't going to matter because it's going to become a shadow in the end anyway. But the first thing I'm going to do is just lay down the lightest color all over the butterfly. And I'm not one of those people who cares whether or not a stamped snowflake has 6 sides or a butterfly is scientifically correct. I just like things to be pretty. And so this is not a representation of a real butterfly. If you're an entomologist and you're offended by my red and yellow butterfly, he's just a fantasy. So I'll just add little pops of red around the edges, which actually just becomes orange on top of my Summer Sun. I guess if anything, he sort of echoes the monarchs that we see here every summer migrating down to Mexico, which I sort of feel like doing right now because our winter has been a little bit long, even for Texas. I like the whole 2 weeks of winter, meaning 2 weeks of 50 degrees. And this winter has been a little bit colder and a little longer. Nothing by Minnesota standards or anything, but too much for my thin blood. I'm ready to see the monarchs. So the other little wing, I'm just going to paint to match. And you want to remember, usually when I'm watercoloring, I did this in a class once, take a look at your image after you're done and make sure you didn't forget a huge section and just left it blank, which I did for one of my watercolor classes. So I'm going to go back and color his body because that would be the thing I would most likely leave blank. And just come back and add pure ink in a few spots just to give the little guy some drama. And I usually work on these for a while. I'm kind of a fidgeter when I paint, so I like to go back over and over again. As you can see, you just get it how you want it. And make sure that you add you'll need a little more water than you think during this process because, like I said, the gesso grabs your paintbrush and grabs the ink and creates a little bit of friction and drag, and the water will just help you move it around more easily. Now I'm going to go in and fix some of the places where I got a little bit of extra ink outside the butterfly. And since it's water-based and the gesso is acrylic, I have a little extra time and flexibility when I have a little bit of ink on the outside. You can even take just a rag dipped in water and correct some of those mistakes and make it look like you were precise right from the beginning, which I never am. And you don't have to worry about being too perfect. If there's a little bit of a halo of one or more of these colors, it will get incorporated into the shadow that we're going to make. But I don't want a big blob hanging out there. For the shadow, I'm going to use Basic Gray ink, which is actually in our permanent ink line. But because I'm using water and painting with it on this acrylic surface, I have a little bit of time to move it around before it becomes permanent. And I'm just going to create a little shadow under the butterfly just to make him pop off the page and enhance the contrast between the shiny and the matte even more than I already have. And you can make your shadows as big or dark as you want. One of the things that I find is when you first put a shadow down, you're sort of shocked by how it looks. But if you just hold it far away from yourself, or don't look at it for a while and look back at it, you'll see that it really adds a lot of dimension to your image, and that it's not as stark as you think it is when you're putting it down on the paper. At least that's what I find. And I love the dimension that it gives, especially with an image like this where you kind of assume that there's motion involved. I think this makes him come to life even more. Now you can actually deliberately pull some of the color from the butterfly into the shadow. I think that color in your shadows makes them more realistic, because in real life our shadows have a little bit of color too. So don't worry about being too much of a purist with the gray or the neutral that you chose for your shadow, because nature is not pure. I think as I look at this larger image, I think this would also, I'm going to put it on a card, but I think it would be beautiful in a frame. It's a really, really dramatic image, and I love the bigger size of it. I like kind of capturing just part of it. You feel like you're seeing it in flight. And I apologize to anybody out there who might be afraid of butterflies. I have heard that there are such people. It's astonishing to me, but I know that a phobia is a phobia. So hopefully you've already turned this video off if you have a fear of butterflies. I wonder what the name for that is. Lepidopterophobia or something. Nabokov would know, I guess. So just finish up, do a little touch up on your shadow, and then When you're done, your yin yang shiny matte project is ready for a card.